Stay hungry, stay foolish.
Friends matter to us, and they matter more than we think. The single most surprising fact to emerge from the medical literature over the last decade or so has been that the number and quality of friendships we have has a bigger influence on our health, our happiness, and even our mortality risk than anything else except smoking. Our guest is world-renowned psychologist and author who famously discovered Dunbar's number, how our capacity for friendships is limited to around 150 people. In today's book, he explores the ways different types of friendships and family relationships intersect, and the complex of psychological and behavioural mechanisms that underpinned friendships and make them possible, and just how complicated the business of making and keeping friends really is. Working at the coalface of the subject at both research and personal levels, he has written the definitive book on how and why we are friends. It is a great pleasure to welcome Robin Dunbar. Robin, welcome to the show.
A pleasure.
There's a saying in innovation, Robin, and it is that innovation happens at the intersections. And when I thought about you and this book, I thought, firstly, this book is all your culmination of all your work, all your studies, all your books in the past coming together to create this intersection. But you too are one of those people who have multiple backgrounds. You're a polymath of sorts and have an intersection of backgrounds. I thought a great way to start would be with that, and to show how the collision and the intersection of so many of your disciplines has led to the unique view of the world that you have.
I do indeed have a very checkered career. I actually started out with aspirations to be a philosopher, but I pretty soon discovered that philosophy was just too difficult. It's for the clever folk. And one could get on much more easily, and in some ways, in much more interesting ways, by leaping into science and becoming a scientist. But I hasten to say, one of the big lessons I learned from doing philosophy as an undergraduate degree was to ignore everybody else's disciplinary boundaries and really try to see the big picture and pull all the different disciplines together. So my career has really been half a century of doing just that. I spent about half my time in psychology departments doing psychology, if you like, and half my time in zoology or biology departments doing ecology, evolutionary biology, genetics. So we span the whole spectrum. And then beyond that, I've always had an interest in history. So a lot of my projects have involved collaborations with historians, collaborations with literature people, people work in drama, as well as, really weird people like physicists and mathematicians at the other side of the universe. So it's been great fun doing that.
With that in mind, Robin, let's share how this book came about, because you said in the book, like many ideas in science, this book and the story it has to tell is a personal odyssey, and it came about by accident. And this is the beauty of such a multifaceted background, such a polymathic background, that you spot things in such a unique way. I'd love if you shared how this book came about.
Well, I suppose in many ways it's an attempt by me to pull together a very long, scattered, disparate research career with a number of separate strands, but always strands leading towards the same big question, if you like. But one of the problems with science as we practice it these days is you end up writing these very short, focused papers scattered all over the place in different journals. And, the journals themselves are discipline specific. People only read if they read anything at all, the journals from their particular end of the discipline, their particular sub-discipline, if you like, and they ignore all the rest. So I began to feel that the kind of big picture was just being lost here in this scattered kind of flotsam and jetsam of papers distributed all over the publishing universe. And it probably would be very helpful if I could draw it all together and show how it all related to each other and why we went from one particular point to another in the course of this attempt to understand, in the end, if you like, friendships, but it's kind of built around a focus on social evolution. Yeah? Why is it that we and our primate cousins, the monkeys and apes, live in these very complex social systems, which are cognitively very demanding? We need big brains to handle them. They're very sophisticated. They're very complex and very complex to study. It's sort of still, if you like, an unanswered question in many ways as to why these complex systems evolve, because obviously not all other forms of life live in such complex social systems, not even all the other mammals. Many of the mammals live in very simple social systems, perhaps just a pair breeding together like foxes do, and many of the smaller antelope, perhaps kind of loose herds which don't have any structure. Primates have these very odd things which are effectively friendships. I mean, realistically, when you watch primates in the wild, it's very obvious that these are kind of bonded relationships of the kind we have with our friends and family, very much the same. So my background originally was really in studying primates in the wild. That's where I cut my teeth and spent the first half of my career wandering around bits of Africa, following groups of monkeys here and there, and groups of antelope as well, to broaden it out a bit. But the second half has really come around to focus on humans. Why is it, what is the nature of human sociality? What's peculiar about it? So it really required me to kind of take a very, very big, broad picture, trying to pull together one end things like the genetics and ecology of social systems, but at the other end, the nitty-gritties of how individuals relate to each other and what friendships are for, what benefits they have for you.
There's so many places I could go there, but you mentioned your observations of primates, for example, and you reminded me of a beautiful story you tell just to show how social and how intelligent animals are. You mentioned the great story of the two sisters grooming the mother's hair. I'd love if you'd share this just to show the depth of your observations.
Well, it kind of is an object lesson in itself, actually, because at the time when this was happening, and I was taking a photograph of it happening in the sort of remote mountains of northern Ethiopia many, many years ago, I didn't actually appreciate what was going on. It was only when I saw the slide afterwards, after it being developed and so on, that I actually realized how interesting it was. But what it showed was a very typical everyday morning session of grooming that the animals have before they set out to go and forage for food. They groom in their little groups. Parents groom with their offspring, or females groom with their sisters in the group, and so on. And here you had a mother with her head down on the ground and her back end sticking up in the air, while her two daughters, a younger one and an older one, were busy at her rear end. And it was the little one that was grooming the fur of her backside most assiduously. But what I noticed the older sister was doing, who was kind of just about on the verge of becoming an adult, she was sort of about puberty age, was she'd got a hand behind her little sister's head and was pushing her very quietly and carefully away. And her head was sort of tucked down, watching her mother's face at the other end, as it were. So she was very conscious of the fact that if the little sister had objected in some way, or the mother had turned round and seen what was going on, she would have got a flea in her ear from her mother for being so mean, as it were. Whereas if she could sort of do this surreptitiously and persuade the little sister to back off, she could take over grooming. And so when mum turned round to the end of the grooming session, mum would notice it was her that was doing the grooming, and she would get all the credit, if you like. And the subtlety of it is really of how she understood the behaviour not only of her mother but also of her juvenile sister. That, you know, if she pushed her quietly enough out of the way, she'd probably wander off and go and play with some of the other kids around about and not make a fuss, which actually, from my notes, was exactly what happened. You know, so life in primate social groups, monkey and ape social groups, is very human in that sense, and it is just full of these subtleties and complexities.
It made me think of like a psychological game of Jenga where you're trying to push the piece out without being seen. And then it made me think of how in organizations, some people try to take the credit for other people's work. There was so much in that piece. But I wanted to reverse to a piece, and it's slightly off topic, but I think it's so important, and why I mentioned your diverse background and your connecting of all the dots of all the knowledge that you've gleaned over the years. Because I often think about this as a huge problem, not only in society, but in innovation and in organizations, where you have people very tightly swimming in their swim lane of knowledge. And when knowledge is we're overloaded with knowledge in these days, where knowledge is freely available, we need more people to think across the swim lanes and connect the dots. And I thought, while it's not part of this book, it's certainly something that you are a huge advocate of and an evangelist of, and I'd love to share your thoughts on that, perhaps.
Well, I think the evidence, if you like, is overwhelming that creativity comes from being able to look over the parapet of your particular little corner of the battlefield of the world, as it were, and see what everybody else is doing. And in doing so, you invariably get a different perspective, or at least if you have the right mindset to think about these things in the right way, then very often you can see a novel dimension. And the history of the development of science over the last, I don't know, couple of thousand years or so is just full of classic examples of that. You know, so my favorite example of this is the origins of the modern atomic theory of chemistry, which has been with us for the better part of 200 plus years now, and is really the foundation of modern chemistry. And that was invented by an accountant, would you please? Anton Lavoisier, who was in charge at the time of the French munitions factory for the French government. And in trying to improve the quality of gunpowder, he developed what was effectively the modern atomic theory of chemistry, and sort of trounced in many ways the existing theories, which were largely the product of some very reputable scientists here in Britain. Of course, it didn't do him any good, because he still ended up on the guillotine in the end.
That's what you get. That's what you get for innovating.
Absolutely. But as one of the sort of intellectuals in Europe commented when they heard that he'd been guillotined, simply because he was, you know, part and parcel of the French monarchy's administrative structures. They hadn't done anything particularly anti-revolutionary during the French Revolution. But they said, you know, with the loss of that head, basically we've lost, you know, the future of European science, pretty much. You know, he was the smartest man on the planet, and these idiots killed him. And we are all the losers for it. So, you know, it's just a kind of reminder that in the end, you know, having a different perspective is very important. I think you see that in kind of innovation type environments, where if you've got a mix of people from different backgrounds, coming in at a problem from different disciplines, if they can work together, and that's the key to it, because the great risk is each of us gets on our high horse, attempts to defend our particular corner on the grounds that it's completely correct and everybody else must be only half correct. But if we can kind of get over that and listen to what others are suggesting and saying to us, then very often, out of the blue smoke comes something really innovative and novel that will change the whole future of whatever area you happen to be working, whether it's, let's say, advertising or science or medicine or whatever.
Beautifully articulated, Robin. I was thinking about something you talked about in the book, and you mentioned about how social the species were, and I thought it was really interesting, the ratio of head size to body size as well. Maybe we'll get into that, but I really found it interesting how, building on what you just said, the idea of this getting on together is absolutely core to the survival of the species, really. And it was a lesser known Darwin quote about it's about collaboration of the species, not just the fittest. And I often take that out of your work, that is so important. But I was interested to when you talked about, say, the foxes you mentioned earlier, but also like the mountain goats who will go off on their own, path, and while antelope that you studied, they will work together as a herd, and the herd mentality actually makes, for example, I could be off wandering and I go, hey, look, there's ripe fruit over here, and I can call the rest of the herd. That mentality is so core for the survival of every species.
Yes, this is true in general. Sort of most of successful evolutionary developments in many ways have involved cooperation in some form. I mean, the most basic form of cooperation is simply the mating pair that collaborate to rear offspring. I'm talking about sort of everyday garden birds like sort of robins and tits and albatrosses and indeed many of these smart birds like parrots and crows and stuff. They're all pair bonded, and that pair bonding is a collaboration between two individuals who aren't related to each other particularly, for the successful production of offspring. So it's not just a case of an egg meeting a sperm, as it were, and producing a baby. You've got to rear the thing up to adulthood so that it reproduces in turn. That's the sort of evolutionary imperative, if you like. So those species which have developed these collaborative arrangements tend to be the smarter species, and also the lineages which are historically the most successful. And among those, in the mammals at least, the primates in many ways come out top. I mean, they've hardly changed in their appearance since they first turned up when the dinosaurs were still around 60 million years ago, the earliest primates, and they've really hardly changed at all over that huge length of time. Whereas species like whales and dolphins have gone from perfectly decent, sensible land-living animals to being designed to live in the sea and change completely in appearance and so on. The antelope, deer sort of group, again, developing these hooved feet for running and looking very different. So, the primate successes come out of the fact that they evolved these highly cooperative social systems that go beyond just the pair, the mating pair. Very often, many of them are quite promiscuous in their mating patterns, but the point of their social systems is that it acts as a cooperative arrangement for protection against predators, essentially. And in that respect, it's realistically, it's an implicit social contract, because if you're going to live in those kind of social systems where everybody sticks together and stays together, you have to be prepared to give up something in order to be part of the group, in order to be able to share in the production, if you like, of the group. This is something that antelope and deer, that whole group of ungulates, don't do. They live on the whole, in these rather, the ones that live in herds, they're very here today and gone tomorrow, often quite anonymous. Strangers mix together and separate and then go and mix with other strangers, whereas primate groups are extremely stable through time. Particularly for females, very often you're born into it, you die in it. at the end of a long life. So they have that stable core, whereas herds that you see in anything from cows to deer and antelope, are sort of here today and gone tomorrow. They have the same function because they're a defense against predation, against being caught by predators. It's there basically just to scare predators off. But I suppose the problem goes to the fact that if you live in any close proximity to people, and dare I say, don't you know it, it's kind of throws up constant levels of stress. People niggle you, they nip your coffee, they buy them a beer in the pub and they never buy you one. All these kind of minor irritations. This is primate life, and it's social life for all sophisticated social species. They all face this problem, and if left to its own devices, it would cause the group to disperse because these stresses would just get on top of you, and it would be unproductive. So groups would disperse, and that's effectively what's going on in herd-forming species. They clump together when a predator turns up, and then gradually, as these stresses increase with time, after the predator has passed by, individuals drift away and the group breaks up, and then they'll reform perhaps with some others if another predator turns up later. Whereas what primates do is kind of go, well, actually, I don't want to be caught on my own, moving between one group and another when the one predator that's going to come that week turns up. I'd rather have my mates around me all the time, because that guarantees that I'll always have my defensive coalition. So it's a kind of a fail-safe kind of strategy. It's a risk-averse strategy. I don't want to be caught on my own. So the origin of these primate groups lies in having these really well-bonded groups to keep them together. And the bonding is necessary to overcome these stresses, because those stresses don't go away. But what you can do is kind of minimize them by having these bonded relationships. And part of that is the formation of coalitions. So the females in particular, because they're the ones that bear the brunt of these stresses, actually, form these small coalitions of 2 or 3 grooming partners who groom very intensely with each other and provide kind of both active and passive protection. So just the fact that, I know that you've got a mate you're always drinking with just discourages me from annoying you too much, right, in the pub, because I know if I annoy you, I'm going to end up having to have an argument with 2 of you. So it just causes me to back off a little bit. And it's that kind of subtle diplomacy, if you like, of everyday social life that makes primate social groups work the way they do.
I thought of some of the characteristics of that from a collaboration perspective, and that whole idea of there's a price to pay for conformity. So you pay a certain price of independence and independent thought in a way. And if you think of our origins on the Great Savannah, the brain in its current sense, my understanding is 200,000 years ago or so, we were in caves. So that idea of wandering beyond the tribe and breaking the social norms becomes very difficult when I'm bringing it back to innovation here. And if you work in a large, complex, bureaucratic organization and you're the person who goes, well, screw the tribe, there's some fresh fruit over here and I'm going to build a new tribe, there's a danger and there's a price to pay for that.
There is. The problem is that in reality, evolution and everyday life, there is no such thing as the perfect solution to anything. And that's partly because the world we live in is complex. There are many things besides just getting enough food in your belly to stay alive that are important in terms of evolution. You've got to feed yourself, yes, but you also have to avoid predators and you have to reproduce successfully. So, minimally, there are kind of 3 dimensions that you have to satisfy, and it's never possible to satisfy all of those at the same time. You have to kind of go for some kind of compromise solution. And one consequence of that is there are very often alternative ways of achieving the same objective, which work quite well. Some may be better in some circumstances, others may be better in others. So you kind of alluded to this, I think, in talking about sitting in your silo, as it were, with all your friends who think exactly like you on the one hand, and sort of mixing silos to get the benefit of other people's views. Now, both actually work. There are circumstances on which having people who are like you actually is probably more productive, because it creates fewer stresses and tensions in many ways. But it really depends on the size of the organization and the topic, the objective of the organization, if you like. It tends to be a small scale thing. I think that's why family businesses work well at the level that they do. That they're family businesses, but they're quite small. It would be very hard, or is very hard, it seems, to maintain a very large multinational conglomerate as a pure family business. There are too many lost opportunities. You have to be able to, well, you may have a family that runs it, perhaps in the boardroom, but the workplace underneath, particularly the innovations, sort of new developments, R&D people need to probably come from a much wider range of backgrounds and disciplines than just your family. But family ties work extremely well in the right place. This what's sometimes referred to as the kinship premium is extremely important if you're down on your luck, because the only people that are going to come and bail you out when all else fails is close family. Everybody else will abandon you, including the people you thought were your best friends. And the only people that will put up with your moaning and groaning and depression or whatever, and sort of say, come along here, let's help you out, are going to be close family. So there are places where choosing the right kinds of people becomes very important. Very often those are people who think like you or have close ties to you, and most close family, whether you like it or not, do tend to think like you. They've grown up in the same little subculture, as it were. So it helps make the flow of interactions and so on, their contentedness, much easier. And maybe you don't want that so much, if it's in the case of trying to break down the frontiers of innovation, because you really need some left field views coming in at that point, and have everybody thinking the same doesn't get you very far. You just keep making the old Morris Minor over and over again. A great car though that was.
And also, well, to your point, or your background, have a polymathic background where you have lots of different disciplines. But I think it's a lovely segue for Dunbar's number. And there's a really interesting phenomenon in Japan in particular, that they have some of the oldest businesses in the world. And so much so that they have a special term for it. It's called shinese, so SHINESE. And it refers to these businesses that are in some way immortal. They keep going. They don't break down. And one of the key ones, I thought this was a nice intersection for Dunbar's number, and particularly Gore-Tex, for example, that WM Gore business, that they keep the numbers low. And because of that, you don't get that deterioration or that breakdown in social bondedness, etc. And I thought that would be a lovely way to introduce Dunbar's number.
Yes. So Dunbar's number is really, I suppose, the limit on the number of functional relationships you can have. That's to say, relationships which are reciprocal. You have the way you feel towards somebody, they feel back at the same level, and you both know it. So these are not kind of one-way relationships. They're very much reciprocal and supportive. They'll come to your aid when you want it. They make up the group of people with whom you spend most of your social time, your core social time, as it were. It turns out that number is about 150, give or take a bit. There is, according to personality, according to gender, according to age, and so on. But on average, across the population, across many populations where we've sampled it, it's always about 150. Varies from individual to individual, between perhaps 100, let's say, for introverts, to about 250 for extroverts, but, sort of settling down in this sort of middle range around about 150. Now, it turns out that actually this kind of came out of the blue, because I was looking at how the size of primate social groups, monkey and ape social groups, related to the size of the brains they had. And there was a very nice relationship between group size and brain size in monkeys and apes. So essentially, the bigger the group, the more relationships you have to keep track of, the bigger the computer you need, so the bigger the brain. And just idly curious, late one night, probably after a couple too many whiskies, I wondered what it implied for humans. If you plugged human brain sizes into it, what would it predict for human group sizes? Now it came this number 150. It seemed rather low, really, especially as I did this in London.
Yeah.
Might have expected it to be a little bigger. But sure enough, when I set about looking for evidence for it in small-scale societies, so hunter-gatherer societies, which are sort of the kinds of societies, informal egalitarian societies, in which we humans have spent 99% of our evolutionary history, then this figure of about 150 turns out to be pretty much universal. It's very much the average size of their groups. And since then, lots and lots of other interesting, weird examples have turned up out of the woodwork. Almost exactly the same thing. And one of them is Gore-Tex, the Gore-Tex company. And it turns out that when Bill Gore was setting up this company, he'd worked for the big American multinational DuPont as a chemist previously for most of his career. He discovered the process that produces the Gore-Tex material. So he set this up as a small spin-off company of his own, and literally in his backyard. And he was very much struck by, when he was working with this huge multinational, just how dysfunctional these big organizations often were, that they became highly kind of siloed and, with sort of little echo chambers within the company who never talked to each other and refused to cooperate with each other. And things would have worked much better and more efficiently if they'd all intersected properly. But here they were, the accountants were refusing to talk to the salespeople, and the salespeople refusing to talk to the people on the factory floor and so on. So he decided that this was a problem of scale, and that there was a optimal size for a factory unit with this kind of flow of information around the system and the sense of obligation and trust and willingness to work together was at its peak, if you like, and that this was somewhere around about 150. And this is years before I discovered Dunbar's number, so he really should get the credit. But he insisted that the kind of structure of all his factories should be built around this number. So as the business expanded, it's a hugely successful business now. It's one of the most successful kind of medium-sized enterprises in the world. But as the sales expanded, rather than expanding the size of the factory, which is, of course, what every other business does, what he would do is just build a new factory, a completely self-contained factory, sometimes literally on the car parking lot next door. But the two factories would be completely self-contained. So nobody needs job titles. Everybody knows who the manager of the factory is. They don't have to have a label on his jacket to say manager. they know that's Jim, and everybody knows who's the person who brings the sandwiches around at lunchtime, and all these kind of things. They don't need special job descriptions and special uniforms because they know them by personal interaction and know them individually and personally. And it seems to be a very successful recipe for business organization. I really don't understand why lots of others don't follow suit, but most businesses are stuck in this kind of hierarchical based, almost military based structure of layers and officers, and you must salute the officers and all this kind of stuff. But it is an amazing setup, and they still do it. I mean, Bill Gore is long since dead, but the business is still family run essentially, and they still maintain this organizational structure. They refer to it as the flat lattice organization, which is a very nice description because you have lots of independent little units scattered all over the US, I guess now, with a single family, what was essentially a family board, sitting above them, and all they were doing were kind of giving each factory their kind of targets to have a sort of strategic perception on the whole process. And then it was up to the factories to get on with figuring out how to meet these, and as a collaboration, as it were, between the workforce and the sales teams and the accountants and the management and so on. So everybody, has lunch together, parties together, and away it goes.
Yeah, I just thought about it. They all know which guy to avoid that doesn't buy you the drink back.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But when you think of how large organizations acquire, so through M&A, mergers and acquisitions, bring in other companies, they usually try and then bring them under the hierarchical structure, and they break down the whole thing. And it's usually because of economies of scale to try and bring costs down. Yeah. But there was one thing I really found fascinating. Firstly, for anybody out there, the amount of research that backs up these numbers. And the other thing is to say, you didn't call it Dunbar's number. It was called Dunbar's number by other because you kept finding this number everywhere in villages throughout the UK, in Christmas card lists, everywhere. It was in telephone directories, everything. But
even in the Doomsday Book, for heaven's sakes.
Wow, I didn't see that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, no. Well, you remember, of course, when that notorious scumbag William the Conqueror walked into England and Wales and took them over from their Saxon kings. He had no idea what he'd actually picked up. So he thought and the Normans were extremely good at administration. That was one of their kind of real skills, administration, organization. So he said, okay, I need to know what I've got here in order to know how much tax to charge them. So he launched the Doomsday Book survey, which is the first sort of major comprehensive civil survey ever done, certainly in Europe. I mean, they may have done them in other empires, as it were, but certainly in Europe, and certainly in Northern Europe, which enumerated everything. Of course, what they didn't count was people, because they weren't interested in people. But every plough, horse, house, field, cow, etc., was enumerated because those are the things you taxed. But the historians have worked out what the village sizes are from the size of the number of houses and the average number of occupants you'd expect to be in them. And astonishingly, it comes to almost exactly 150 is the average for pretty much every county in England and Wales. It's quite remarkable.
Wow, it's really, really fascinating, and you go on to talk about it in social media like Facebook and all these kind of things. I think we'll put that aside and let people read the book to find that out, because there's so much more in this book where you bring in some of your other theories. And one of them that's fascinating was, firstly, I mentioned purposefully the avoiding Frank, the guy who never buys you the drink back, because we have only a certain capacity to remember a certain amount of faces. which is important because if you work in a large organization, you kind of get, people by their title and not their face, and that has an effect. But the really, really fascinating one that I'd love if you share is the social brain hypothesis.
Okay, so the social brain hypothesis is really just at root this relationship between social group size and brain size that we find in primates, and pretty much uniquely in primates. We don't see it in that form in any other groups of birds or mammals. What we find in other groups of birds and mammals is that species that have pair-bonded mating systems, and particularly stable pair-bonded mating systems that last a lifetime, have bigger brains than those that live in completely promiscuous mating systems. So think of crows and albatrosses and eagles and so on. These are pair-bonded species. They all have big brains sitting on top of their modestly little bodies, whereas things like the many promiscuous shorebirds and stuff tend to have very small brains because it's the cost of maintaining a stable relationship through time that is the problem here. So it's having a big enough computer to manage that. Now, what happens in primates, you almost uniquely have a few other examples where it probably happens as well, but we don't kind of really know enough about them. An obvious one would be elephants, but there are only 2 species of elephants. But in primates, what you have is this generalization of this pair-bonded effect to non-reproductive relationships to create friendships embedded within these bonded social groups, which is how the social brain hypothesis has its appearance, as it were, in primates. But of course, it's not just an issue of memory per se. Yes, you do need to be able to remember who is who, and also need, very importantly, to remember who did and who didn't buy you a beer last time down the but you have to be able to do a number of other things which are at least as important, probably more important really than pure memory. One of them is to be able to understand how somebody else is thinking in order to be able to predict what they're going to do, or how they would respond if you did X, Y, and Z. Right? Would they, sort of give beat you up for it, or would they be your best friend afterwards? So you have to be able to predict that, and to be able to predict then also what the consequences are for their friends. If you start buttering up Jim, is Fred going to be outraged as you try to nick his, sort of darts partner or something like that? It's these quite subtle calculations that we actually do all the time, but they're extremely costly in terms of computing power. And then the other key component is this ability to inhibit what are called prepotent responses. And these kind of stable, lifelong social systems and lifelong relationships are really totally dependent on in many ways, on this ability to kind of put the lid on your instinctive response to something, so that you don't upset the apple cart. So, you can, rather than grabbing the biggest piece of cake on the plate, or indeed the whole cake, you just hang back and allow others to have their share too. That kind of thing, not stealing from other people, bearing in mind that they have an interest in being part of the community and not there simply for you to exploit. Those forms of implicit cooperation are really critical to these stable, bonded social groups, the kinds we find in monkeys and apes, and especially humans. And indeed, across monkeys, their ability to inhibit these prepotent responses, as it were, improves as their brain size increases. So they've got those 2 very important components. And then, if you like, at the cognitive end, and then underpinning them and providing some of the kind of mechanisms to allow these things to work together, is a whole nother layer in the kind of pharmacology of it all. That particularly involves the neuropeptides that are known as endorphins, which are part of the pain management system in the brain. They're incredible little molecules that turn up all over the place in many different contexts, but their main function is as part of the pain management system, because they're opiates. The name endorphin is a contraction of endogenous morphine. Endogenous meaning the brain's own. Morphine, because chemically they're very, very similar to morphine, but the differences are small, but enough that we don't get addicted to them in the destructive way we get addicted to morphine and other opiates, as it were. So what these do is create this sense of kind of relaxation. That's the opiate effect, of warmth, of trustingness, of contentedness, of happiness, with whoever you're doing these core activities that we engage in the social world. And in particular for monkeys and apes, that's social grooming. That's how they bond their friendships, how they create and maintain their friendships. So the more time you spend grooming, the more you trigger the endorphin system, and it does a specialized neural system from the skin that only deals with that. It's all it responds to. Light, slow stroking at exactly 2.5 centimeters a second. Slower or faster, there's no effect. It's the speed of grooming. And it still works with us. That's why you give people hugs and put an arm around their shoulder and a pat on the back and all these kind of things that we do with our closer friends and relations. But what we've done has been to find other mechanisms or other behaviors that trigger the endorphin system in contexts where we don't physically have to touch somebody. So the constraint of grooming is it's very much a one-on-one. It's a very intimate one-on-one activity. So there's an upper limit because the strength of a friendship, the strength of a relationship depends totally on how much grooming you do with that individual. That limits the size of groups you can live in. When during the course of our evolution, when we wanted to increase our group size from the sort of normal maximum we find in monkeys and apes, which is about 50 on average, is the largest groups we find in monkeys and apes. When we want to push that group size up towards Dunbar's number, we had to find other ways to, in effect, groom virtually with more individuals so that we could kind of increase the size of the group. And what we've done is lit on, historically really, a number of behaviors that turn out to have this property, and in order of which probably we acquired them. Their laughter, which probably is pretty ancient. Indeed, we share laughter with the great apes. Well, it's in a slightly adapted form in humans. Singing, dancing, the rituals of religion, feasting, so eating in itself, eating socially, alcohol, drinking alcohol, and particularly drinking alcohol socially, is an extremely good trigger of the endorphin system. Telling emotional sob stories, highly emotional stories, these are all very good. Storytelling kind of in general all seem to be extremely effective triggers of the endorphin system, and allow us to do it because we don't have to touch the other person. We can do it with more individuals at the same time. So we can kind of use our time more efficiently, if you like, to increase the size of the group. And laughter is a kind of good example of that, because remember, grooming is a one-on-one thing. It's still a one-on-one thing with us. I invite you to test this by taking a couple of other people to the cinema when we can go to cinemas again, and sitting in the back row with them, one on either side, and try cuddling with both of them. And I can bet you within 10 minutes, one of them will have walked out in a huff because you've not been paying them enough attention. Right? Very intimate, kind of focused, one-on-one thing. And what laughter does is generalize that. So what happens with laughter is we have a little group of people that we will laugh with. In fact, it's about three to four people is really the upper limit on a laughter group. It's the same size as the conversation group. But what's interesting about that, so although there are 2 or 3 other people who you're making laugh by telling your witty joke, you also laugh as part of this. So bearing in mind that in grooming, it's only the person being groomed that gets the opiate high. In laughter, all of you get the opiate high, including the groomer, because you all laugh. And it's these kind of relaxed, contented belly laughing, if you like, that really triggers the endorphin system like crazy. Of course, think of music and singing, then it's unlimited. And there you are on the football terraces or the shinty terraces or whatever it may be, the rugby terraces. And, you could all burst into communal song. And it really is a very, very bonding process for, several thousand people at the same time. Well, on your side, anyway.
I heard once that endorphins came from the whole idea of you have to get up in the morning and go and hunt your food. So they're released in the body to quell the pain in the way. And that when you laugh, then there's a rattle on your internal organs. So your body thinks you're under attack. So it releases the endorphin. And I thought of it, from a social bonding perspective, like a neurochemical carrot to go, you're supposed to be together, you're supposed to collaborate and work together. And as you say in the book, it's way less demanding to go and wonder, is this fruit ripe, or go and look for new berries over there, than it is to actually interact with a tribe of people. And I say that to say, let's talk quickly about, because I know you're under time pressure, about the whole idea of how the longevity of life and the happiness of life when you do have friends, because it's something that sometimes we neglect in the pursuit of a vision like work or writing books or whatever. Sometimes we neglect those people that we really truly need later in life.
This is true. And I think this partly goes back to what the value of having friends is. Now, okay, the story we've worked our way around so far has largely been in terms of creating groups. But remember that to create those groups, what happens is we create these small subsets of individuals that we groom a lot with or interact a lot with, that act as coalitions that buffer us against the stresses of living in these big groups. So just keep everybody kind of off our backs a little bit, so we don't suffer so much from those stresses. Now, that little subgroup of friends, which typically will be about 5 people, usually split half and half between close family and close friends. Those 5 people account for 40% of our total social time investment, or emotional investment, or social capital, if you like. We invest very, very heavily in them. And it turns out that they have huge additional benefits for our psychological well-being and our physical health, even our longevity. So one of the surprises from the epidemiological literature, the medical literature from the last 10, maybe 15 years only, has been this sort of positive tsunami of publications showing that the best predictor of how happy you are, how physically healthy you are, how your ability to recover from major surgery, even your risk of dying, are affected by the number and quality of those close friends, that close friendship circle. And there's huge quantity of data. We've just publishing a paper just now, some massive sample of 130,000 people surveyed across half a dozen European countries, looking at the risk of depression. And the risk of depression is much lower the more friends you have. Now, there isn't a kind of, there is an optimal size, because the problem is you have to invest a lot of time in each of those friendships to make it work in this kind of way. So there is a limit, and that limit is about 5. But, we can choose a little bit in terms of what works best for you. So introverts will perhaps have 3 or 4 best friends, whereas extroverts might have 5 or 6, that kind of range of variation. So, the fact that you have less than 5 needn't be a bad thing. Let's put it this way. They're still doing the same job for you, because it's just the dynamics of how the relationships work that really is the only difference. But the effect that those have is on both your mental well-being, your risk of dementia in the future in old age, as well as your risk of physical diseases, certain physical diseases, particularly the ones that have a long, slow onset. So, the fast onset diseases, like liver cancer is a particular example. It tends to be very quick. It has these effects don't appear at all in that context. But things like heart conditions and so on, the number of friends you have actually is the best thing you can do in terms of ensuring that you live as long as you possibly can with this condition. And in the studies that have been done of this, the number of and quality of friendships you have for heart attack patients, and they're measuring, the chances of surviving the next 12 months after that first heart attack. That's their very, very sharp measure, if you like. It's very hard-nosed. The best predictor is the number and quality of friends you have, and then a little way behind that is giving up smoking. And a long way behind comes everything else that your doctor usually worries about, namely, what pills are you on? How overweight are you? What exercise regime are you on? What do you eat? What's the air quality in your neighborhood? All these things, of course, they all have an effect, a small effect, but it's much, much smaller than just having good friends. The difficulty, of course, is you can't just magic friends up out of nowhere and suddenly decide the day you get your heart attack, I'd better go and make some friends. It doesn't work that way. You have to have these friends there and already part of your social network before the heart attack comes. So take my advice and start now building.
I thought about that. The cognitive energy is important because, you get this dynamic when people first start going out with the opposite sex and the friends start giving out and going, we never see Robin anymore. Not since he started going out with that Mary, and everybody starts arguing. Yeah. But that's why, because you don't actually have the cognitive energy to give to those people.
And it's just a time thing, the sheer investment of time. I mean, speaking of these romantic relationships reminds me of one study we did, which looked at the size of that close inner circle of optimally five best friends. And we asked people who completed this survey to say whether they were in a romantic relationship or not. And I'd say a kind of the early phases of a romantic relationship, the first decade, let's say, when it's still exciting and stuff like that. And this is actually a complete accident, because I don't know even why we put the question in, but when we looked at the data, what just astounded us was the fact that, yes, everybody who was declared that they weren't in a new and invigorating romantic relationship had the conventional five best friends and close family in that circle. And this is defined as, we define this circle as the group of people you would go to, it's your support clique, go to for emotional, social, financial, economic, whatever support when your world falls apart. How many people do you feel you can count on that would, at the drop of a hat, come and kind of bail you out and chiver you along? But people who are in an active romantic relationship only had four. So the bad message here is that falling in love loses you friends, and the bad news is it actually loses you two friends. If you just think about what's going on here, you arrive at this point where you first meet Mary with five close friends and family. You invest so much time in Mary that you end up having to then sacrifice your friendships with somebody else. And that's because you've actually pushed that layer up to six. So it's the original five plus Mary. And now Mary's taking up two lots of time, right? Of your 2 units of your time. So what's actually happened is you've given up two friendships for the sake of your romantic relationships. It just shows how importantly we regard our romantic relationships. We're prepared to pay this enormous price. What's even kind of more amusing in many ways is, remember, this is sort of that in a layer of 5 best friends is sort of 2 friends, 2 family, and one or the other to make up the number. And you kind of go, well, who do you give up? If you're going to have to sacrifice 2, do you give up your 2 friends? You don't go drinking with them anymore? Or do you give up your 2 close members of your family? Now, there are kind of trade-offs here because, at the end of the day, family, you don't want to sacrifice them completely because they're the people who are going to bail you out when everything else falls apart in your life. You need to keep them in the loop. But on the other hand, when you go along and say, she's deserted me, she's abandoned me and left me, and I'm really miserable. Family are inclined to say, well, we never liked her much anyway. This is not what you want to hear. The only people that are going to do the right thing, which is a hug round the shoulder or take you out for a beer, are the friends. So you don't want to abandon your friends either. And in fact, what we do is we let one family member go and one friend go. So we keep one of each as our kind of fail-safe. It's really subtle.
It's absolutely fascinating. Robin, have you time for one more question on gender?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, because I think, firstly, I was thinking when you were saying that about, I found out that the hard way because I had a very small wedding below 50 people and I had to cut some people. So we all learn that way when we come to the wedding list. But it gets me onto gender because when there's a lot of talk about diversity, particularly at the moment, and it's in innovation in particular, like you've talked about earlier on, it's neurodiversity. It's how we think. And I think this is so often overlooked when we talk about diversity, but gender does have an effect on how we think. And I thought it was fascinating that you shared how women have more friends is one thing. They spend longer on the phone and use technology more to connect with those friends, which was fascinating. And then if you think back to the origins of that, they had to maintain the tribe, the cohesiveness of the tribe. And there wasn't that male ego, testosterone driven competition for who was the alpha male at the top of the tribe.
Right. Yeah. And I think, this obviously has been 50 odd years or maybe much longer sort of hand-wringing and angst about gender differences, mainly focused on IQ. Where there are very few differences. It would be very surprising if there were a lot of any significance. But what's been kind of overlooked, I think, is the fact that men and women live in very, very different social worlds. Now, that may be very relevant in some businesses and completely irrelevant in others. You might imagine that in innovation, it kind of doesn't really make a lot of difference, those kind of social aspects of the thing, so much as the kind of intellectual side that you can bring to the workplace. But there may be other areas of work or life where, and one might think of, for example, the health service in particular, where women may just be much better at dealing with the kinds of approaching the problems that need to be solved, because they're social problems, they're if you like, human problems, and they're just much better at that than men are. And this goes back to the fact that if you look at the dynamics of how men and women maintain their friendship circles, they're really extraordinarily different. Men's relationships, friendships tend to be very casual and here today and gone tomorrow. And many wives have expressed deep frustration, I know, because they will say to their husbands, well, you haven't contacted Jimmy, who you spent your entire childhood playing football with. Why don't you give him a ring? And the response is usually a blank look and a shrug and, oh, well, maybe tomorrow, but not today. Whereas women will be on the phone to kind of keep those relationships going all the time. And it is kind of amusing in many ways that, technology, and particularly digital technology, everything from the phone to Facebook, which are largely invented by blokes because they're techie things, the ones doing the techie things, at least at the time. But they've been much more heavily exploited by women than by men in this social domain. So and sort of in the more general sense of of texting. Here's this facility that was introduced into mobile phones by some imaginative techie somewhere in Silicon Valley, who thought it might perhaps be useful. The railway company could send you a text to say your train is late because the wrong leaves were on the line and it's been slowed down or whatever. And they never imagined that it would be used as a social tool, and okay, it's quite useful and people do, have notifications sent to them about whether their train is going to be early or late or what have you. But it's far more heavily used for social relationships and social exchanges than anything that I'm sure the original designers ever had in mind. In fact, it had happened very quickly as well. I mean, within 6 months, people were using that facility for these social texting, and it took the entire mobile phone industry completely by surprise. They just never imagined it. But this sort of differences between men's and women's social world is really built around the way in which the two sexes bond with each other. And it's just very different. In women, it's very, very conversationally based. And they're picking up huge amounts of information from what's going on in other people's lives. And this kind of allows them to kind of keep the wheels of the social network well oiled and ticking over and working. And they will remember things which blokes, who were there at the time. Classic is, again, I've heard several people comment on this. A couple will be at a dinner party, and the wife will come away with complete knowledge of everybody's children and what they're doing, and their aunties and their uncles and their grandparents and what have you. And they'll mention just a husband who was at the same conversation, and he'll sit there and look blankly at her and go, "What? We never talked about any of that."
Their relationship's in trouble. I can see it. You're like, what?
Well, yes. I mean, but this is, if you like, this is an example of having a mix of disciplinary strategies.
Yeah.
that makes the relationship as a whole tick, however frustrating it may be at times. But for blokes, it's actually doing stuff together. I mean, we looked at what prevents relationships decaying over time when people move away from where they were living, so they can't see their old friends very easily. And for women, whether the friendships survived and continued to be valued, if you like, and maintained, depended dramatically on how much extra time they devoted to trying to keep touch by phone, by Facebook, Skype, or whatever. Whereas conversations had absolutely zero effect on the guys' relationships at all. What made the difference was taking the time to get together and do stuff. Now, do stuff might be, sort of joining the five-a-side football every Friday night, or going down the pub for a beer, or climbing a mountain, or canoeing around the whole of Ireland. Whatever your sport or activity, it might be stamp collecting, going to do train spotting. It doesn't really matter what the activity is. It's better if there's some physical component to it, because that triggers the endorphin system better. But it's just doing stuff. And I have this kind of vision of what boys and men's relationships are really like with that. There's that famous photograph you often see examples of, two old Greek men sitting in the sunshine outside a taverna with either side of a table, and they never speak to each other, and occasionally they sip their ouzo or glass of wine or something. Now that's boys bonding. Right? Nothing happens, nothing is done, but they're bonding, believe me.
It's fantastic. And, I thought one final kind of get a little bit of a belly laugh and endorphin for our audience was the telephone data on how long was spent on the phone.
This is true, yes. I mean, I've often made a joke out of this and said, this perhaps the fact that conversation, as it were, talking together, is what maintains and services women's relationships. That's how they work, is reflected in the fact that 14, 15, 16-year-olds will get home from school, and then the girls will be on the phone for an hour to the people they've spent all day with, whereas you're jolly lucky if you can get 7.5 seconds out of a boy on the phone. And I always maintain this is because boys have nothing to talk about on the phone except I'll see you down the pub at 7. That's all you need to say, because talking together really doesn't do anything for them. It's actually doing stuff together, banging their heads together, if you like. That is the way they bond. And I used to sort of give that as a kind of joke, if you like. But it did prompt us to actually look when we got hold of one of the big national, not I hasten to say, an Irish or a British national telephone. So you're all safe there.
It's all right. Your records are safe.
But from another European country, and there it was. I mean, it wasn't quite as exaggerated as that, but girls, if I remember rightly, girls' phone calls were about twice as long on average as boys were, and especially so if late at night. And they were calling a boy.
Oh, right. Okay. And the boys kind of going, can we just meet up? I thought,
my advice, I mean, I emphasize the a boy, right? Because it's very specific. My advice is if she calls you at midnight and is on the phone for an hour, it is serious. Just wake up and sniff the coffee.
Brilliant. And, Robin, I was just going to say the depth and breadth of your work is so refreshing to read everything. And what I really think is so important is those things I mentioned about diversity and the understanding and the empathy that, they say men are from Venus, women from Mars, whatever that was. We have different brains. We have different brains. We operate differently. And when you understand that, you can kind of take pause and second and go, I'm not going to judge. I'll take a step back. And it's the same then with collaboration and diversity in organizations, that you kind of go, we actually need this in order to survive with the rate of change and the amount of data coming down the line. We need everybody to act as sensors, and we need their brains to be safe and feel psychologically safe so they can absorb that data. But it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I've been chasing you for a very long time. And to our audience, I highly recommend reading anything by Robin. I have behind me a couple of books here. Evolutionary Psychology is there, and The Science of Love and Betrayal. I have loads more in my Kindle here beside me. And the latest book is this book, Friends. It's the culmination of so many of your lenses, Robin, all coming together to give us this new gift that you've given us. And I know there's many more on the way. It's been fascinating chat, an honor to speak to you. And I know we're hoping to have a chat in the new year, maybe an intersections chat. Hopefully we can bring that together, yourself and Robert Sapolsky. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. Robin Dunbar, thank you for joining us.
A pleasure.